That night, when the corpse opened its eyes and looked at me, I knew the dead don't always rest in peace.
Have you ever imagined the suffocating sensation of being trapped inside a coffin, with no air, no light, just the crushing weight of wood and earth on your body? The idea seems absurd, almost unthinkable, but throughout history it's happened more times than you'd like to believe. People were declared dead too soon, buried alive, and in some cases discovered when it was too late. Just thinking about it makes your chest tighten, as if the air were thinning around you. Now imagine being responsible for watching over this silence, night after night, inside a nearly forgotten mortuary chapel in a small American town where no one dares to go near it after sunset. This was precisely the life of a solitary gravedigger I met through an old story, someone who swore he'd heard the impossible. He wasn't a man to believe stories. On the contrary, his routine was made up of hard work and disbelief in superstitions. But on that particular night, faced with a sealed coffin and an empty awake, his sanity would be tested in a way few could endure. What seemed like just another ordinary night turned into a disturbing encounter with that which shouldn't exist. And the most uncomfortable detail is that he wasn't drunk, he wasn't drowsy. There was nothing that could justify what he witnessed. He heard something real, something that still echoes in his mind like an endless nightmare. Because in the absolute silence of that room, he began to hear breathing. If you like real and disturbing horror stories, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support this work. The funeral chapel where everything happened was simple, like so many others scattered throughout the American countryside. Outside, the walls were covered in old paint that was peeling from the humidity, and the sign bearing the name of the family responsible for the place was barely hanging on, corroded by time. Upon passing through the heavy wooden doors, visitors were greeted by a narrow corridor that led to the main room where the wakes were held. Wooden benches lined symmetrically stretched up to the altar, creaking with the slightest movement, as if each step disturbed the imposed silence within. The scent of wilting flowers mingled with the faint scent of melted wax from candles slowly burning in metal holders, casting a flickering light that seemed to play with the shadows. On that particular night, there were no family members to pay their respects. The coffin lay alone in the center of the hall, sealed, surrounded only by floral arrangements that were already beginning to exude a heavy, almost cloying scent. The gravedigger, accustomed to solitude, sat near the entrance, trying to ignore the strange feeling the emptiness conveyed. He knew every corner of that chapel, knew the sound of every creaking board and every window rattling in the wind. But even so, he couldn't shake the impression that something was off about the atmosphere. The antique wall clock ticked relentlessly, each second seeming to drag by more slowly than the last. It was as if the room itself was breathing with him, exhaling an invisible weight that thickened the air. The gravedigger tried to occupy his mind with banal thoughts, memories of other long nights, but everything there kept pulling him back to the present, to that disturbing silence that seemed to harbor a hidden threat. The more he tried to ignore it, the more he felt an uninvited presence, something watching him from some dark corner. And it was in this stifling atmosphere, amidst the creaking of the benches and the muffled sound of the clock, that the first signal appeared. A faint, almost imperceptible sound that would make anyone believe he was just imagining it. But for him, it was the beginning of something he would never forget. At first, it seemed like just a stray noise within the room, a muffled sound that could easily have been attributed to wind passing through a crack or the creaking of the ancient wood supporting the ceiling. But there was something different about that night, something that made that small sound stand out as an anomaly within the absolute silence. The gravedigger raised his head and looked around carefully, trying to locate the source, but nothing moved. The candles remained steady, and the clock continued its slow, almost cruel rhythm, as if mocking his uneasiness. He took a deep breath and tried to convince himself that nothing was wrong, but soon the sound repeated. This time clearer, closer. It was like heavy, labored breathing, coming and going irregularly. His heart raced, and even though he didn't want to admit it, he knew exactly where the sound was coming from. Each time the breathing echoed, his gaze was inevitably drawn to the sealed coffin that lay alone in the center of the room. The sound wasn't coming from the walls, the ceiling, or any hidden corner. It was coming from there, from within the sealed coffin. His feet refused to move forward, but his mind could no longer ignore it. It was impossible to deny it. The breathing was there, low but increasingly noticeable, as if with each repetition it became more desperate, closer to a sigh for help. He placed his hand on the bench beside him, trying to find support, but the wood seemed to vibrate with it, as if the space itself absorbed the sound. It was at that moment that the truth struck him in a disturbing way. This wasn't a figment of his imagination. It wasn't the echo of his own thoughts. It was real, and he knew that from then on, nothing in that room would be silent in the same way. For a few seconds he stood paralyzed, trying to rationalize the impossible. His mind searched for logical explanations, any justification that might alleviate the growing terror gripping him. Perhaps it was simply the wind rushing through some hidden space, or the sound of plumbing echoing off the walls. But each of these hypotheses was dispelled as his breathing began to sound again, irregular, as if someone were struggling for air inside the coffin. Cold sweat began to run down his forehead, and his heart was pounding so hard he thought it could be heard in the absolute silence of the room. It was then that his memory played a cruel trick on him. He recalled old stories he'd heard about people buried alive in the United States during the 19th century, when there were still no reliable methods of confirming death. At that time, desperate families even installed bells, attached by ropes to the wrists of the deceased, a mechanism known as a safety coffin, in case someone woke up after the burial. He'd never paid any attention to these legends, but now, faced with that undeniable sound, they returned with frightening weight. With each new, stifled breath, his mind wavered between two opposing certainties. Opening the coffin might reveal a victim still fighting for life, but it might also expose something that should never see the light again. The dilemma became unbearable, and the breathing inside the coffin seemed to match his rhythm, growing faster, more desperate, as if begging for his action. He stood slowly, feeling his legs tremble under the weight of the decision, and with each step the air in the room grew heavier, almost impossible to breathe. And it was precisely when he gathered the courage to approach that the silence was broken in an even more disturbing way, beginning a moment in which the fear stopped being just psychological and became physical, palpable, and impossible to ignore. The first step toward the coffin was like crossing an invisible threshold. The air seemed thicker, as if each breath required greater effort than normal. The gravedigger, his body already gripped by an involuntary tremor, walked slowly, each creak of the floor echoing like a warning to turn back. But there was something stronger than fear driving him forward. The feeling that someone, or something, was truly alive within that sealed coffin. When he finally approached, the muffled breathing was so clear it seemed to reverberate in his own chest, as if there were no barrier between the world of the living and what lay within. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the sealed lid, trying to summon the courage to take the next step. With a trembling hand, he braced himself against the cold wood and instinctively pressed his ear against it. It was at that moment that the silence ceased. A loud, ragged sigh escaped from within the coffin, filling his mind with a cruel certainty. Something was breathing there. The sound wasn't just audible, it was almost physical, vibrating against the wood and his skin, as if pulling him deeper into that cramped, suffocating space. Before he could retreat, he felt a slight movement. The lid vibrated, barely perceptible, but enough to make his body freeze. He slowly pulled his face away, breathless, and the breathing inside transformed into something even more disturbing, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a moan, thick with despair. His heart raced, and for a moment he was certain the coffin would open on its own. But the terror hadn't yet reached its peak. That was when a warm breath crossed the empty space and touched the back of his neck. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't an echo. It was real. Too close. Impossible to deny. His entire body shivered, and his mind begged him to turn and face what was behind him. The problem was, in that instant, he knew that whatever he saw would forever change his understanding of the living and the dead. He didn't dare look immediately. His body was paralyzed, the air trapped in his lungs, and every muscle begged him to flee from there and never return. When he finally found the strength to turn around, the hall was empty, lit only by the candles that flickered in a ballet of shadows on the walls. There was no one behind him, no sign of presence except the echo of his own rapid breathing, mixed with the distant creaking of the wood. The coffin remained in the same place, sealed, motionless, as if nothing had happened. Yet he knew it hadn't been his imagination. The warm breath on the back of his neck, the irregular sound inside the coffin, all of it was etched with cruel precision in his memory. The next morning, when he reported what had happened, his story was laughed at, chalking it up to fatigue and the weight of the funeral atmosphere. Doctors confirmed that the body had no vital signs and that any movement or breathing was impossible. But for him, there was no explanation that could support the reality of what he had experienced that night. Since then, he refused to remain alone at vigils, carrying the burden of a secret no one would believe. The most disturbing thing, however, was not the silence that once again reigned in the chapel, but the persistent feeling that what he had heard was no mistake. It was a warning, and in that same city, other gravediggers were already murmuring about similar events, hushed. Accounts of wakes where something breathed inside the coffins. Perhaps soon I will need to tell what happened to their next one. Have you ever walked into a completely empty funeral chapel, and even with no one around, had the strange feeling that you weren't alone? I'm not talking about the common sensation anyone might feel in a too quiet environment, but something deeper, as if there were invisible eyes watching every step, as if the walls held presences that don't want to be forgotten. This feeling has always accompanied me during my nights of vigil, but there was one in particular that has never left my memory. It happened in a small town in the American countryside, where chapels like that hold stories that rarely anyone dares to tell. It was an old building, used for decades for mostly discreet wakes, where few family members attended, and often the only attendant for the deceased was the gravedigger himself. I was accustomed to the silence, the darkness, and even the scent of aged flowers. But that night, something different lingered in the air. The emptiness of the room felt charged, as if an invisible crowd were lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I wondered if it was just a figment of my imagination, but deep down I knew that impression wasn't born out of thin air. I promise you, it wasn't a fleeting vision, nor the result of fatigue. It was real, and the more time passed, the clearer it became that I wasn't alone in that chapel. Because that night I saw something no human being should witness. Shadows that not only appeared out of nowhere, but chose to sit in the pews as if waiting for a funeral that never began. If you like real and disturbing horror stories, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support this work. The funeral chapel sat on a quiet street, surrounded by old houses and trees that seemed to lean over the building as if to hide it from the rest of the city. Outside, the paint was peeling, and the windows, even closed, revealed cracks through which the moon cast beams of pale light, illuminating just enough to heighten the eeriness. As you passed through the heavy wooden doors, the sounds of the city disappeared completely, as if the place existed in a separate dimension, a space where time stood still and the presence of the dead dominated everything. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The dark wooden benches, symmetrically aligned, creaked with the slightest touch, and every detail reinforced the feeling that this space was not meant for the living. The walls, covered in faded religious paintings, reflected the light of candles burning slowly in rusted sconces, casting unstable shadows that stretched out like arms, reaching for whoever entered. The air was heavy, permeated by the scent of old flowers that no longer gave off their fragrance, but rather a sweet odor of decay mixed with melted wax. I walked slowly down the central corridor, the sound of my boots echoing like a desecration in the absolute silence. Each step seemed to attract something hidden, as if the space itself were aware of my presence. Some nights the atmosphere remained merely somber, but on that particular night there was something different, an energy that seemed to envelop me completely. It wasn't just silence, it was anticipation. The air seemed to hold its breath along with me, waiting for something to manifest. As I observed the empty pews and the solitary casket in the background, I realized this wasn't just a place abandoned by human presence. It was as if the pews themselves held the memory of every funeral ever held there, willing to relive each one, even without living people to fill the space. And it was in that moment, amidst the heaviness of the space and the uneasy flickering of the flames, that something began to shift before my eyes, as if the room decided not to remain empty much longer. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, perhaps a consequence of the accumulated fatigue of so many sleepless nights. The shadows cast by the candles flickered irregularly, stretching across the pews, and for a brief moment I had the impression they were moving independently, as if they didn't depend on the light to exist. I blinked a few times, trying to dispel the sensation. But when I focused my gaze again, I noticed something that made me freeze completely. In the first pews, very close to the altar, dark figures seemed to be sitting, motionless, as if watching an invisible ceremony. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the flickering light, but the clarity with which those shapes occupied the seats left me speechless. They were human outlines, dense, not transparent like an optical illusion, and even still, they conveyed the impression of restrained movement, like people in profound silence, waiting for something to begin. I took a deep breath, but the air entered my lungs heavy, bringing with it the scent of rotting flowers, intense, as if they had just been scattered throughout the chapel. The smell made me cough, but not. Even the sound of coughing altered the demeanor of those figures. The most disturbing detail, however, was realizing that every time I looked away and back at the pews, more seats seemed occupied. It was as if, with each blink, new presences slowly materialized, filling the empty spaces, until transforming that solitary wake into a ghostly assembly. My hands began to tremble and my body refused to move forward, but neither could I move away. I was caught between curiosity and dread. It was at that precise moment, amidst the heavy silence and the suffocating odor, that I realized this wasn't an isolated illusion. Because when I looked again, one of the candles flickered violently, and for a second I was absolutely certain that all those figures had turned their faces toward me at the same time. For a moment, I tried to cling to reason, searching for logical explanations that would alleviate the weight of what I was witnessing. I told myself they were merely plays of light, distortions, created by candles swaying in the wake of invisible air currents. Perhaps fatigue was playing tricks. Perhaps my exhausted mind was creating non-existent images. But no matter how many times I repeated these excuses silently, none of them could erase the clarity of the scene before me. The figures were there, occupying the pews like silent worshippers, and the dense air of the chapel made it impossible to ignore them. It was then that another disturbing detail appeared: the smell of rotting. Flowers, which had previously been merely annoying, became almost unbearable, filling every corner of the room as if originating from dozens of garlands scattered throughout the space, even though I knew there were only 2 wilted arrangements. With each breath, the odor seemed stronger, entering my nostrils and clinging to my throat, as if part of an invisible ritual. I tried to move, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, and my heart hammered in my chest at an irregular rhythm, as if anticipating inevitable danger. Suddenly, a subtle sound broke the silence. Footsteps. They weren't coming from me. They were light, shuffling, and echoed down the side aisle of the chapel. My instincts wanted to believe it was just the wood giving way, but I soon realized the footsteps were mixed with something even more uncomfortable. Murmurs. They were low voices, almost like prayers, that seemed to come from the very shadows seated in the pews. I didn't understand a single word, but the tone was somber, charged with something unworldly. At that moment, I understood that it wasn't just about witnessing the inexplicable, but about being a part of it. And the thing that terrified me most was realizing that, faced with so many presences, I didn't know if I was being tolerated as a spectator or prepared as a participant in what was to come. The tension reached an unbearable point when I realized that one of the figures no longer remained motionless like the others. On the third bench, to the left, a figure began to move with disturbing slowness, as if each gesture were calculated to prolong the torment of those watching it. I saw its dark body rise in absolute silence, casting an even denser shadow against the wall, until it stood and turned toward me. In that instant, I understood that I was no mere distorted reflection. It saw me, recognized me, and seemed to decide what to do with me. There was no face, no eyes, just a deep void, a darkness that seemed to pull everything around me, including my breath. The more I tried to look away, the stronger the feeling of being dragged into that nothingness became. A chill ran down my spine, and my hands began to sweat, despite the temperature in the room having plummeted as if someone had opened all the doors to winter. The silence was broken by a dull creak. The bench directly behind me had moved on its own, as if someone else had just sat down. My body froze, my mind screamed to run, but my legs simply refused to obey. The shadows on the other benches remained motionless, but the ones standing there seemed to be moving closer, even without taking a single step, as if the space between us were being shortened by something invisible. My breathing grew heavy, not just mine, but as if dozens of lungs were filling the air at once, stifling every attempt to reason. At that moment, I realized they weren't mere spectators at a non-existent funeral. They were there for another reason, and everything indicated I was part of this silent ritual. The most terrifying thing was realizing that, as I blinked, the figure that had risen was no longer just in front of me, but in front of me, close enough that I could feel its presence touching my skin like an invisible pressure. And it was precisely at that moment, when the fear already seemed unbearable, that I heard the creaking of the benches again, only this time in unison, as if they were all getting up at the same time. My survival instincts took over, and finally, my legs obeyed. I ran down the chapel's central aisle without looking back, feeling the cold air bite my face and the scent of rotting flowers permeate every breath. The wooden doors, which had so often felt heavy, now swung open as if to expel me, hurling me out into the darkness of the night. The silence of the street was a momentary relief, but my body still trembled, and the feeling of being followed didn't disappear even when I reached the sidewalk. The next morning, I returned to the Hugh Chapel, my heart torn between fear and the need to confirm that I hadn't gone mad. The chapel was as usual, silent and empty, but the pews bore marks that shouldn't have been there. On the polished wood, dark stains in the shape of hands and arms, as if dozens of presences had leaned against it during the night, left a physical record of what I had witnessed. No plausible explanation was found, and the order was simply to ignore it, as if silence could erase what had happened. Since then, I've never entered that chapel alone. I still feel, when I close my eyes, the moment those shadows rose in unison, as if the ritual hadn't ended, but merely awaited the next opportunity. And what torments me is knowing that that night wasn't the only one. Because days later, another gravedigger came to me, pale and in shock, swearing he'd seen something even more terrifying in an empty wake. And that, perhaps, is a story you're not yet ready to hear. Have you ever stood before a casket in absolute silence and had the strange sensation that you weren't alone, even when there was no one else in the room? I'm not just talking about that natural uneasiness anyone feels in a death-related environment, but rather something much deeper, an invisible weight that seems to creep through the air and materialize in the reflection of a glass window. This sensation isn't uncommon for those who work at funerals, but that night, in a small rural American town, a gravedigger experienced something that forever marked his memory. It was winter, and the cold wind blew against the high windows of the mortuary, causing the heavy curtains to move slightly as if breathing. The silence was so intense that every creak of the wood echoed like a whisper, and the candles scattered in antique candlesticks cast a flickering light that seemed to distort reality. The coffin rested in the center, covered in wilted flowers, and the clear glass of the lid reflected the surroundings strangely, as if revealing not only what lay before it, but also what should not be there. As he turned off the last lights and walked slowly toward the exit, the gravedigger glanced quickly at the coffin. Then, in the reflection of the glass, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A woman dressed in black, standing behind the coffin, motionless, as if expecting the deceased to awaken at any moment. He turned to look, but there was no one there. If you like real and disturbing horror stories, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support this work. The city's funeral hall seemed to carry on its walls the weight of all the stories that had passed through it. It was an old building erected at the beginning of the last century, and every detail bore the mark of time. The tall windows, decorated with stained glass that had already lost its original colors, let through only pale moonlight, creating distorted patterns on the wooden floor. The heavy, thick, dust-smelling curtains blocked most of the cold, but they couldn't prevent the wind from whistling through the cracks, bringing with it a sound reminiscent of distant laments. The precisely aligned pews creaked, even when no one sat, as if they still held the memory of the faithful who mourned their dead there. The religious paintings hanging on the walls, already darkened by time, cast shadows that stretched into almost human forms, creating the impression that the room was fuller than it actually was. The candles, held in rusty iron sconces, burned slowly, spreading a flickering flame that seemed to play with the sanity of those who lingered too long. The air was filled with the cloying scent of wilted flowers, mingled with the heavy odor of old wood and melted wax, creating a suffocating scene. The gravedigger knew every detail of that place well, but that night, familiarity brought no comfort. On the contrary, every element seemed charged with a strange energy, as if the room were not just a physical space, but a portal to something beyond comprehension. The wall clock ticked at intervals that sounded longer than usual, dragging out the seconds as if to prolong the suffering. It was in this space that he made his rounds, checking doors and candles, when his eyes once again fell on the coffin in the center. The glass covering it reflected not only the unstable light, but something else, an image that didn't belong in the space he believed he knew. And it was in that moment that the certainty that he was alone began to fade, paving the way for a terror yet to come. When I looked at the coffin again, something made me catch my breath. The glass reflected not only the candles and the surrounding pews, but also a silhouette that shouldn't have been there. It was a woman, dressed entirely in black, standing behind the coffin, so close she seemed to be touching it with her fingertips. The veil covered her face, but her rigid posture conveyed an almost disturbing devotion, as if she were waiting for the awakening of whoever rested within that wooden box. For a moment, I thought a relative had silently returned to say goodbye, but that thought was dispelled when I turned to look and saw absolutely no one there. My heart raced, and my first reaction was to believe it was a distorted reflection of the dark curtains mixed with the flickering candlelight. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and returned my gaze to the glass, hoping the figure had disappeared. But no. It was still there, motionless, its head slightly tilted as if intently observing every detail of the dead man, waiting for some movement. The silence in the room seemed heavier than ever, and the candle flames flickered as if reacting to its presence. Each time I looked away and back, the figure seemed to grow clearer, as if my resistance only strengthened its existence. The cold intensified, and no matter how hard I tried to rationalize, something inside me knew it wasn't an illusion. It was real, but it could only be seen through the glass, as if the woman belonged to a space between worlds. And it was at that moment that I felt with disturbing clarity that she was not just watching over the dead, but that she was patiently awaiting something that was yet to happen. For a few seconds I remained motionless, unable to decide whether to flee that room or face what was happening. My mind screamed that it was nothing more than a reflex, perhaps a cruel play between light and shadow, but my body didn't believe it. Cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and each heartbeat seemed to echo like a drum inside my chest. I tried to convince myself that the exhaustion of long nights of work might be playing tricks on me, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the clarity of that figure. It wasn't a blur, it wasn't a distortion. It was someone standing exactly where I knew no one was. Suddenly, the wall clock, which always kept time with its insistent chime, stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, so profound that the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The candles continued to burn, but the flame wavered strangely, as if an invisible draft were concentrated solely around the coffin. A chill gripped me, not the natural chill of a winter night, but something icy that seemed to seep into my bones, draining any sense of life. I closed my eyes, forcing myself not to give in to panic, but the murmurs that echoed immediately after made me open them immediately. They weren't coming from outside, they weren't coming from me. They were low, incomprehensible whispers that seemed to float from the reflection in the glass. The woman in black remained motionless, but I could have sworn her mouth, hidden by the veil, moved slowly, as if reciting words meant only for the dead man who rested within. And it was in that moment that I understood that the most dangerous thing wasn't to see her, but to keep looking. Because every second that my eyes insisted on remaining fixed on the reflection, the greater the feeling that she noticed me too. My entire body trembled, but I still couldn't tear my eyes away from the glass. The woman in black remained there, motionless, and even though the veil covered her face, I had the distinct impression that her attention was focused solely on the body resting inside the coffin. It was at that moment that something changed. Her head slowly tilted forward as if observing every detail of the deceased, and a shiver ran down my spine as I realized her lips were moving beneath the dark fabric. There was no sound, only the subtlest movement, as if she were murmuring a forbidden prayer or calling the deceased by name. My breathing grew heavy, and I felt the air in the room thin, as if that presence were absorbing all life around me. I took a step back, but the creaking of the floorboards seemed too loud, like a scream awakening something that shouldn't be disturbed. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow, shuffling, getting closer, but when I turned, there was no one, just the empty corridor, plunged in shadows. I turned my gaze to the glass and nearly lost my breath. The woman was no longer still. Her face, previously turned toward the dead man, now seemed slightly turned toward me. A biting chill spread through the room, and the candles nearly went out all at once. The clock, which had previously stopped, let out a metallic click as if it had come to life. And at that very moment, the glass trembled, as if something inside had pressed against it. My heart raced, and every muscle begged me to run, but my feet refused to obey. The reflection showed the woman growing ever closer, as if the space between us was shrinking with each blink. It was then that I realized the true horror wasn't just seeing her standing there. The terror lay in the fact that she seemed to be waiting not for the dead man, but for my reaction. And when the glass shook for the second time, I had the distinct impression that whatever was inside didn't want to lie there any longer. When I finally regained control of my body, I whirled toward the door with the urgency of someone fleeing death. Each footstep echoed through the hall like thunder, and I felt as if at any moment something would reach me from behind. I pushed open the heavy doors, which creaked as if resisting my escape, and the icy dawn wind enveloped me like a belated rescue. My breath came in gasps, my eyes burned from the effort to stay open, and even from outside, I still felt someone was with me. The next day, I returned to the hall in a desperate attempt to prove to myself that it had been merely the result of exhaustion. But what I found made me wish I had never returned. The glass of the coffin was marked with clear female fingerprints, as if invisible hands had pressed against the surface during the early hours. No one could explain, no one dared comment, and the order was simply to bury the body as quickly as possible, as if burying the dead could bury the mystery as well. I could never trust reflections again after that night. The woman in black wasn't just a figure lost in light and shadow. She had purpose, intent, and seemed to hold secrets no living person should ever witness. But what haunts me most is that, days later, another employee reported seeing the same figure, only at a different wake, standing before a different coffin. Perhaps, deep down, she was never just my vision. Maybe you're still out there waiting for a new encounter. Have you ever experienced the strange sensation of hearing your name called when you were absolutely certain you were alone? I'm not talking about that kind of daydream where the wind seems to imitate voices or when your tired mind plays tricks. I'm talking about something much deeper, a sound so clear it seems to materialize inside your ear, bringing with it an overwhelming certainty that someone knows who you are, even when no one is around. That's exactly what happened to me on a night I've never forgotten, inside an empty funeral home in a small, quiet town in the American heartland. The early morning was cold, and the old building where I worked as a gravedigger seemed even gloomier than usual. The narrow hallways and walls covered in crucifixes and religious portraits darkened by time created an already uncomfortable atmosphere. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden benches and the muffled sound of the wind outside. I did what I always did. Turn off the lights, check the doors, organize the space to prepare it for the next day. Everything seemed normal until it happened. That's when I heard my name being called. Clear, distinct, almost intimate, as if the voice had formed right behind me. For a moment I froze, imagining it was someone late or even a cruel joke. But when I turned to check, I realized the room was as empty as before. And that's when I realized the night was just beginning. If you like real and disturbing horror stories, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support this work. The funeral home where I worked always had a heavy atmosphere, but that night there was something different, almost palpable in the air, as if the walls were breathing along with me. The space was large, but the darkness made it seem like it was shrinking by the minute. The wooden benches, lined up in perfect rows, creaked at random intervals, as if remembering they had borne the weight of hundreds of goodbyes. The scent of wilted flowers mixed with aged wood and melted wax created a cloying perfume that seemed to cling to clothes and skin, accompanying anyone who dared to linger there too long. On the altar, an ancient crucifix hung on the wall, its shadow cast by the flickering candles elongating strangely, as if moving of its own accord. The candles burned lazily, releasing small columns of smoke that rose in spirals until they disappeared into the high ceiling. Each flame wavered, as if reacting to an invisible draft that insisted on circulating through the space, even with all the doors and windows tightly closed. The moon, seen through the gaps in the thick curtains, cast silvery patches that made the shadows even denser, creating figures that the weary eye could easily mistake for people. I walked slowly, checking every detail, feeling the floor creak beneath my footsteps. The echo of my own footsteps seemed multiplied, and each turn of the key in the doors gave me the sensation that something was locking itself in, instead of protecting me from what was outside. The grandfather clock on the wall ticked away in slow intervals, as if each second lasted longer than usual, prolonging the discomfort. It was an environment where normality itself became oppressive, as if the house of the dead held its own secrets hidden beneath layers of silence and shadow. And it was within this suffocating atmosphere that I realized the sound I'd heard hadn't been a daydream. On the contrary, it was just the first sign that the night wouldn't leave me alone. I continued my routine, trying to ignore the strangeness that pervaded the room, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I passed the empty coffin, I swore the silence grew denser, almost as if absorbing the sound of my footsteps. It was then that I heard my name again, even more clearly. The voice was low, hoarse, and seemed to come from inside the room itself, so close it made me turn around. Immediately, there was no one there. The emptiness around me was absolute, and yet my heart was already beating with the urgency of someone about to face something they don't understand. I decided to walk down the side corridors, looking for any sign of movement. With each step, the wood creaked as if something were walking alongside me, but my vision found nothing but the shadows cast by the candles. "It's just fatigue," I repeated to myself, trying to make sense of what had no explanation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. That call had been too clear to be a hallucination. It was then, as I returned to the center of the room, that a second voice rose up in the silence. This time, it was soft, feminine, almost a lament, and again, it spoke my name with the intimacy of someone who had known me for a long time. My body froze, and I instinctively looked toward the crucifix, as if seeking some kind of protection. The crucifix remained in place, but the feeling that overcame me was that I had crossed an invisible threshold, a point of no return, and little did I know that those whispers wouldn't stop. Instead, they were only beginning to multiply, as if every corner of the room held a different voice waiting for my attention. The next few seconds dragged on like an eternity, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just my tired mind, reality crushed me with an impossible clarity to deny. The voices didn't stop. On the contrary, they began to repeat themselves, at increasingly shorter intervals, as if vying for my attention. First, a low, drawn-out tone that seemed to come from deep within the earth, calling my name with painful slowness. Soon after, a higher-pitched, almost childlike timbre repeated the same syllables, only at a rapid, anxious pace, as if in a hurry to be answered. Each voice carried its own emotion. Some sounded like pleas, others like orders, and all enveloped me in a symphony of laments that seemed to have no end. The hall, once empty and gloomy, now became a macabre echo chamber. The walls echoed back, multiplying them until I could no longer discern how many voices actually existed. It was as if every pew, every dark corner, every cracked stained glass window had found a way to speak to me. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was no precise pinpoint. They were everywhere, inside and outside of me. I began to sense that the sound came not only from the physical space, but also from the coffin itself in the center of the room. It was as if the dead who once rested there still echoed through the wooden walls, trying to drag me to their side. The voices became so insistent that it wasn't just my name they were calling out anymore. Some repeated disjointed syllables, almost in strange languages, but they all converged on a single goal: to make me advance to the coffin. And it was at that point that I realized that resisting might not be enough, because the growing feeling was that if I didn't obey, something much worse would happen. I no longer knew if what I felt was fear or paralysis. The voices blended into a suffocating chorus, growing closer and closer, so much so that they seemed to touch my skin with each syllable. The once large hall seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as if to push me toward the center, toward the coffin that waited motionless beneath the flickering glow of the candles. My name was shouted and whispered at the same time, in different tones that made me lose track of direction, as if I was surrounded by invisible presences. Suddenly, all voices ceased in a brutal silence, so abrupt it made my ears ring. My heart hammered as if it wanted to leap out of my chest, and in that moment of false calm, I realized something had changed. The crucifix on the altar, which had previously held steady, began to sway gently, as if someone had run a hand over it. I stared, and with a single sharp crack, it detached itself from the wall and fell to the floor, producing a metallic sound that echoed throughout the space. That was the signal. The candles went out simultaneously, as if an invisible breath had swept through the room. The darkness enveloped me so intensely that for a few seconds I no longer knew where I was, only felt the overwhelming presence around me. And then, like a final blow, all the voices returned together. This time, not in whispers, but in a single, deafening scream that pronounced my name with devastating force. It was unbearable. I ran toward the exit, stumbling over benches, feeling something following me with every step, something that didn't belong here. I pushed the heavy doors with all my strength, and when I finally reached the outside, the cold dawn wind enveloped me. But even then I found no respite, because in the whistling of the wind, through the dry branches, I could still hear my name, soft, drawn out, as if reminding me that this wasn't over. The next morning, my legs still trembling and my mind filled with memories I wished I could erase, I returned to the hall. The crucifix remained on the floor, its wood splintered by the impact, seemingly carrying a silent message, as if it were more than just an accident. No one had entered after me, and yet the room felt different, heavy, as if it had absorbed what had happened that night. The pews still held the scent of burned candles, and the echo of whispers seemed to have permeated the air, silent but present. I walked to the altar, and bent down to hold the crucifix. The cold of the wood pierced my skin like ice, and for a moment I felt as if the voices would return the instant my hands touched it. But they didn't. The silence was absolute, and it was in this emptiness that I understood there was no way to explain the inexplicable. The voices knew my name, and perhaps they always had. Names carry power, and when spoken in the dark, in a tone of lamentation, they can cease to be mere sounds and become invitations. Invitations that should not be accepted. Since that night, I've never heard anyone call my name without feeling the chill that I might not be alive. And to my surprise, I discovered I wasn't the only one. Days later, another gravedigger confided that he'd heard his own name echoing inside an empty wake, accompanied by signs he should never ignore. And it's his story that's perhaps even more disturbing than mine. Have you ever stopped to imagine what you would do if, amid the absolute silence of an empty wake, a corpse simply opened its eyes and stared directly at you? I'm not talking about a misinterpreted shadow, a misleading reflection, or the imagination of someone exhausted. I'm referring to a real cold gaze coming from a body that should have remained motionless forever. The scene I'm about to recount was no urban legend, nor a story made up to scare co-workers. It was something I saw with my own eyes, something that has stayed with me since that early morning when everything inside me begged me not to believe it. But reality gave me no choice. That night, I was alone at the wake. It was one of those long shifts where the silence seemed to stick to my skin, making every movement, every breath, almost an invasion into a space that didn't belong to me. The clock slowly ticked away, and every creak of the floorboards resonated like a warning that I shouldn't be there. There were no visitors, no family, just me and a body resting inside the casket. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, as if something was watching my every move, every step I took. And it was precisely this impression that turned into certainty when I realized that the dead man seemed to react to my presence. Not immediately, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible way, as if waiting for the exact moment to reveal himself. If you like real and disturbing horror stories, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support this work. The funeral home where I worked wasn't like the modern ones many are accustomed to seeing, filled with light and soft colors meant to soothe families' grief. It was an old place, built decades ago, with dusty stained glass windows that let in pale moonlight, casting distorted figures on the peeling walls. The smell was always the same, a mixture of damp wood, wilted flowers, and the heavy perfume of disinfectant that tried to mask the odor of time. Every step I took on the wooden floorboards creaked, echoing through the empty room, as if an announcement that someone was still walking there, even if only I was standing. The heavy curtains blocked most of the view outside, but a few gaps let in streaks of silvery light that seemed to shift as the night wore on. The candles, scattered in tall holders, burned lazily, casting shadows that grew and shrank as if breathing. The crucifix above the altar completed the stifling atmosphere, its solemn presence both comforting and terrifying. I made my usual rounds, turning off a few lights, organizing misplaced objects, always feeling as if time stood still. On that particular night, the silence was so dense it felt weighty. It wasn't the usual silence of an empty room, but a silence that pressed against my chest, making the air feel colder by the minute. My eyes, even accustomed to the environment, began to capture strange details. Shadows that didn't correspond to any object. Reflections that appeared and disappeared in the cracked glass. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that exhaustion explained everything. But there was something there that insisted on reminding me that it wasn't just fatigue that was with me. And it was in this scenario, in this almost unbearable weight, that I noticed the first sign that something inside that coffin was about to move, as if it wanted to confirm that my presence had been noticed. As I walked slowly through the hall, hearing only the creaking of the wood beneath my feet, a strange sound broke the silence. It wasn't the wind rustling through the cracks, nor the usual creaking of ancient walls. It was something heavier, more drawn out, as if a body had shifted a few inches inside the coffin. My heart instantly raced, and I froze, trying to convince myself it had simply been the wood giving way. But deep down, I knew it had been more than that. I approached the coffin with hesitant steps, feeling the cold increase as I closed the distance. The air seemed denser, almost solid, forcing each breath to come in short, heavy breaths. I leaned in slightly, intending to make sure everything was in place, but at that very moment I felt the dead man's head move, even if only slightly. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to chill my blood. I instinctively pulled away, trying to find logical explanations. Perhaps it was the reflection of the candle flame. Perhaps my fatigue was creating illusions. But no matter. How many times I repeated this mentally, I couldn't shake the image of the head that seemed to have moved on its own. I stood still, staring at the coffin for long seconds, as if waiting for something else to happen. The silence now was even more ominous, as if the entire room was waiting with me. It was then that I noticed a detail that made my legs tremble. The corpse's eyelids, which had been closed, began to slowly lift, revealing that the initial movement had not been a trick of my mind. The dead man was about to open his eyes. When my eyelids lifted completely, time seemed to stop around me. What I saw in that instant was not an ordinary human gaze, but a pair of completely white, pupilless eyes, as if covered by a milky mist. Yet there was something conscious in them, something that made me feel I was not just looking at a lifeless body, but at something that saw, recognized, and was interested only in me. It was impossible to look away, as if those eyes had trapped me, forcing me to face something that should never have happened. The candles lighting the hall began to flicker violently, their flames stretching and twisting as if a gale were sweeping through the room. But there was no wind. The air was still, stifling, and yet the shadows cast by the walls distorted into strange, elongated figures that seemed to move independently. Each creak of the wood grew louder, as if the entire building reacted to the impossible happening within. My body trembled, but I couldn't move. It felt like those eyes were holding me in place, like invisible claws piercing my mind. It wasn't just the horror of seeing a corpse open its eyes, but the disturbing certainty that those eyes weren't random. They weren't staring at the ceiling, they weren't wandering through the void. They were watching me, directly, as if waiting for a response from me, as if wanting to provoke a reaction. And it was at that moment that I realized the movement wasn't over. The blank stare was just the prelude to something much more terrible that was about to happen. The next moment was like crossing an invisible boundary between what is real and what should never exist. The body, which until then had seemed motionless, except for its blank, fixed gaze, slowly moved its head toward me, as if to confirm that it was truly observing me. The sound that accompanied this movement chilled me to the bone. A dry crack, as if ancient bones were being adjusted, echoed through the room, multiplied. By the silent walls, I knew I needed to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if gravity had increased only to keep me trapped there, facing something that defied explanation. The corpse's hands remained crossed over its chest, but its neck bent even further, and it felt as if at any second it would rise completely. Each small shift produced an uncomfortable sound, like wood creaking or stiffened flesh resisting movement. The candles, now reduced to almost nothing, flickered, desperately casting shadows that seemed to stir like an audience of invisible figures. The air smelled of burnt wax and rotting flowers, and I could have sworn a cold current ran down my spine, as if someone had run a hand there. My eyes, wide, couldn't look away. The most terrifying thing wasn't just the body threatening to rise, but the certainty that the dead man knew exactly who stood before him. It was a pupilless gaze, but one that conveyed awareness, as if judging me, as if waiting for some reaction from me. I didn't know if it was anger, regret, or something even darker, but I knew it wasn't just a reflex. And it was at that point, when my head seemed ready to rise beyond human limits, that I understood. It wasn't just the body in the coffin watching me. Something larger, invisible, was watching that act, manipulating the impossible before me, and I was about to discover the price of that revelation. The moment I reflexively closed my eyes, as if to protect myself, the entire room seemed to cease movement. When I finally found the courage to open them again, my body was motionless, exactly as it should have been from the start. My hands still crossed over my chest, my head in its original position, my eyes closed as if they had never opened. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could convince me that I had imagined it. The silence that followed was more suffocating than all the whispers and cracks that had occurred minutes before. It was as if the entire room had gone back to sleep, but I knew I had been awakened by something I shouldn't have. The next morning, when I returned to check on the scene, I noticed a detail that made me question whether I had truly escaped that night. The coffin was slightly shifted, as if it had been pushed forward a few inches. No one had disturbed it. No one but me had access to that room. It couldn't have happened alone. I stood before it, unable to approach, feeling the invisible weight of a gaze that still seemed fixed on me, even though I didn't have my eyes open to confirm. And it is at this point that the question that has never left me in peace remains. Do the dead really rest? Or are they just waiting for the right moment to open their eyes again? If you want to hear more disturbing stories like this, subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell so you don't miss future videos. I have even darker stories to tell, and some of them are even harder to believe.